April 17th, 1944, 3:12 a.m. Over the Norwegian Sea, 210 miles north of Tromsø, the Catalina flying boat moves through a sky of iron. Wind scrapes against the fuselage and frost spreads like veins across the glass. 11 men sit in silence, shoulders pressed against their gear, breath turning to mist. The smell of oil, cold metal, and damp wool fills the cabin. Outside, the world is black water and darker clouds. Flight Lieutenant John Alexander Cruickshank, 24, guides the aircraft through the night. His eyes trace the faint green glow of the instruments. The altimeter needle wavers. The horizon has vanished. For 8 hours they've been patrolling empty sea, a slow, endless search for submarines that leave no wake. Then a voice cracks through the intercom. Contact, bearing 094, surface target. No one breathes. The radar operator repeats it louder this time. Probable U-boat. Range 8 miles. Cruickshank leans forward. Confirm course. Still east by north, sir. He nods once. Visual search. Minutes drag like hours until the forward gunner whispers, target in sight. A sliver of steel glints against the swell. A submarine running on the surface, decks wet with spray. Men move across it, tiny shadows against the sea. Type VIC, the navigator murmurs. She's charging batteries. Cruickshank's hands tighten on the controls. Prepare depth charges. Arm and ready. The Catalina dips into descent. Altitude 500 feet. 300. The airframe trembles. The U-boat's deck gun flashes. Tracer fire rises in streaks of orange, cutting through the darkness. The first shell rips past the nose. The second punches through the wing, trailing sparks. Taking fire, someone shouts. Hold her steady, Cruickshank says. His voice stays level, unhurried, almost quiet. The crosshair slides across the conning tower. Bombs away. Nothing happens. The plane lurches upward, but the depth charges stay locked beneath its belly. Failure on release, the bomb aimer yells. Cruickshank pulls back on the yoke. The Catalina claws upward through bursts of flak, engines howling. Metal rattles, rivets groan. He clears the attack zone and levels out above the clouds. Only then does he exhale. The co-pilot turns to him. Orders, sir? He checks the gauges. Fuel good, hydraulics damaged but stable. The bombs are still live. Standard procedure says break contact, return to base, report. Another crew will finish it later. But below, that submarine will already be diving. Tomorrow it could be waiting for a convoy of merchant ships, and hundreds of sailors who will never see it coming. Cruickshank looks down into the dark. He thinks of the names of men lost to U-boats. The decision forms without debate. We're going back in. The co-pilot hesitates. Sir, she'll be ready for us now. All the more reason, Cruickshank answers. We won't get another chance. The crew exchange silent glances. No one argues. They trust him. They always have. The Catalina banks wide, climbing through low mist. Frost shatters off the wings like shards of glass. Inside, the cabin hums with quiet dread. Each man checks his station again. Ammunition, altitude, fuses, rituals of control against fear. Cruickshank steadies his breathing. His pulse matches the slow beat of the engines. The sea below glows faintly in moonlight, silver streaks over black. Somewhere down there the U-boat waits. Second run, he says. Lower this time. No mistakes. They descend once more. Tracers climb to meet them, faster now, brighter, each one a line drawn straight at their hearts. The Catalina shudders under impact. Fragments of glass spray across the cockpit. Cruickshank does not flinch. His eyes stay fixed on the target. The bombardier calls distance. 900 yards, 7, 5. Steady, Cruickshank murmurs. Hold her steady. The world shrinks to the rhythm of his breathing. In, out, focus. He feels the aircraft vibrate through his bones. The tracer fire becomes a tunnel of light and he flies straight through it. Bombs away. This time the release works. The Catalina jolts upward, lighter by thousands of pounds. Behind them, explosions bloom across the sea. The concussion shakes the aircraft like thunder. For a moment, there's only smoke and boiling water, and then, beneath it, the shadow of the U-boat breaks apart. A cheer rises from the rear cabin, brief and disbelieving. Cruickshank doesn't join in. He's already checking altitude, damage, and heading home. Then the flak finds them again. A shell bursts against the fuselage. Something hot tears through the cockpit. Cruickshank feels it like a hammer blow, first to his chest, then his legs, then everywhere at once. The world flashes white. He grips the controls tighter. The Catalina lurches, begins to roll. He hauls it level through sheer instinct. His lungs burn, he tastes blood. The engines keep turning. The U-boat is gone. The sea is empty again. But the night has only begun. Before that night in 1944, before the flak and the smoke, before 72 wounds carved his name into history, John Alexander Cruickshank was just a quiet boy from Aberdeen. He was born in 1920, in a city built of gray granite and sea wind. The gulls circled the harbor, fog rolled in from the North Sea, ships came and went with the tide. His father worked in a bank, a man who believed in order and discipline, and John grew up the same way, methodical, polite, and calm. He wasn't a thrill seeker. He liked precision. His school notebooks were neat, his shoes always polished. Teachers described him as steady, the kind of student who listened closely and never hurried. Even as a child, he preferred logic over luck. When other boys argued or fought, John would quietly step aside and let tempers cool. It wasn't fear, it was control. Life in Aberdeen moved slowly, predictably, until the clouds of war began to spread across Europe. The radio filled every home with new names: Poland, Norway, Dunkirk. Each week brought fresh casualty lists. To most people, the conflict still felt distant, but for John it began to feel inevitable. He saw men from the docks leaving in uniform and wondered if he would be next. He finished school and took a job in a local bank. He was good at it, organized, trustworthy, uncomplaining. But every morning, as he walked along Union Street, the posters in shop windows reminded him that others were fighting and dying while he added up ledgers. The thought worked on him quietly until one day he walked into the recruiting office and signed his name for the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve. He was 19. Training began in 1941. The first months were all ground work. Navigation tables, mathematics, weather charts, endless repetition. John studied the stars until he could draw a night sky from memory. He learned to read a compass in turbulence, to calculate drift and wind speed in his head. Instructors noticed his focus. Dependable under pressure, one of them wrote in his file. Then came gunnery school. Long days at the range, short nights of rest. He learned how to fire from a moving aircraft, how to adjust for airspeed, and how to hit without wasting a single round. He didn't enjoy it, but he understood it. Skill was survival. By 1942 he began pilot training. The aircraft were simple, the danger constant. He flew through rain and ice, through mechanical failures and bad landings, until caution became instinct. Fellow trainees liked him but said he was hard to read. He never cursed, never bragged, never complained. He simply did the job. When his wings finally came, he was assigned to Coastal Command. While others dreamed of Spitfires and dogfights over France, he received a lumbering giant, the Consolidated Catalina. It was a flying boat, built for long patrols over empty seas. Slow, patient work that demanded endurance more than aggression. It suited him perfectly. Coastal Command was the overlooked arm of the RAF. Their mission was to protect convoys from the invisible threat below, German U-boats. Each patrol could last 16 hours or more, flying low and cold, searching the endless gray water for a ripple or shadow that might mean death. It was exhausting, freezing, monotonous, and vital. Cruickshank adapted quickly. He memorized the Catalina's sounds, the pitch of its twin Pratt and Whitney engines, the groan of the fuselage in rough air, the faint hum when ice formed on the wings. He learned to navigate by instinct and by smell. He could tell when they were near land simply by the change in the air. Older pilots taught him what manuals never mentioned: how to calm a panicked crewman, how to keep warmth in the cabin when the heater failed, how to ration strength over endless hours of cold. Most of those mentors disappeared before the year ended, lost in storms or shot down over the Atlantic. Their absence hardened him. By 1944 he was one of the most reliable officers in his squadron. He had flown dozens of patrols without incident. The younger men looked to him for steadiness. He never raised his voice, never let frustration show. When turbulence struck, he said, "We'll ride it out." When equipment failed, he said, "We'll make do." And when fear began to whisper through the cabin, his silence steadied them more than words ever could. What others mistook for coldness was discipline. To him, control was courage, the quiet strength to act when everything else collapsed. Every patrol strengthened that belief. Every hour in the air made him more deliberate, more exact, more certain of what must be done. He wasn't born fearless. He became it. By the summer of 1944, the Battle of the Atlantic had stretched into its fifth relentless year. The German U-boats were bleeding, but they were far from finished. Every night, Allied convoys still disappeared beneath the waves, victims of torpedoes fired from the unseen depths. 4 men like Flight Lieutenant John Cruickshank, the war was not marked by victories or headlines. It was measured in hours spent above that cold, endless sea, waiting for the next contact that might never come. He was stationed with No. 210 Squadron RAF at Sulham Voe, the Shetland Islands, a lonely outpost at the northern edge of Britain. The place smelled of fuel and salt, a landscape of wind, peat smoke, and the restless sea. It was a world where daylight lingered late and the cold never left. The Catalina flying boats rested on the gray water like great metal swans, engines ticking softly, their hulls glinting faintly in the brief sun. Daily life was mechanical, ritualistic. Pilots and crews rose before dawn, ate in silence, and went through the checklist that had become second nature. Navigation charts, weather reports, fuel levels, depth charge settings, it all had to be exact. A single oversight could mean never returning. The Catalina was not glamorous work. It was slow, heavy, and vulnerable. There was no armor, no speed to escape, and no margin for error. Yet it was indispensable. From their bases, Coastal Command crews patrolled the gap between Scotland and Norway, the Black Pit, where convoys were most exposed to submarine attack. Each mission lasted up to 16 hours, most of it spent staring at empty water. The crew's world shrank to the hum of engines and the steady pulse of instruments. They drank lukewarm tea, read bearings, and fought exhaustion. In those long hours, discipline became everything. Cruickshank was a natural commander for this kind of war. His calm voice over the intercom, his precise decisions, his refusal to rush, all of it kept his men steady. They said that even when the weather closed in and visibility dropped to zero, his tone never changed. "We'll hold this course," he'd say, and somehow they believed him. He was known for doing things by the book, but there was more to it than obedience. He understood that the book existed because others had died writing it. Every rule in the manual was the ghost of a lost crew. By mid-July 1944, intelligence briefings had grown tense. Reports warned of U-boat reinforcements moving north from the Bay of Biscay. Germany was desperate, throwing its remaining submarines into the Arctic routes to cut off supplies to the Soviet Union. Convoys heading for Murmansk and Archangel were under constant threat. Sulham Voe's Catalinas were ordered to sweep further north and stay airborne longer than ever before. Cruickshank's crew had flown 3 such missions that week. They'd seen nothing but fog and sea ice. The fatigue was visible in everyone's faces, hollow eyes, unshaven cheeks, and a weariness that settled deep into their bones. Yet, when orders came for another patrol, nobody hesitated. Routine was survival. The evening of July 17th was clear and windless, a rare gift. The sun hung low, refusing to set, painting the sky a dull orange that would soon fade into Arctic twilight. On the slipway, mechanics checked the Catalina's fuel lines and propellers. The crew moved quietly, each man knowing his task. Cruickshank walked the length of the aircraft one final time, hand gliding over the cold metal skin. He stopped at the nose turret, glanced at the twin .303 Brownings, and nodded to the gunner. No words passed between them. At 8:10 p.m., engines coughed to life. The Catalina skimmed across the still water, rose slowly, and turned northeast toward Norway. The lights of Sulham Voe dwindled behind them, swallowed by mist. For hours they flew in silence. The sea below looked like molten glass, the sky above, a mirror of gray. The routine set in, bearings called out, drift corrected, instruments checked. The men settled into the rhythm of another long night. Around midnight the air grew colder. Icing began to form along the leading edges of the wings. The navigator marked their position, north of the Lofoten Islands, well inside enemy waters. They were alone. Cruickshank glanced over the control panel, everything steady. He took a sip from his flask and said quietly, "Maintain altitude at 2000. We'll sweep east before turning back." Hours passed. Nothing but static from the radio and the whisper of wind. Then at 3 a.m. the radar operator straightened. "Sir, I have a contact. Surface echo. 8 miles, bearing 094. Cruickshank's eyes lifted from the instruments. "Repeat that." The radar blip flashed again, steady and clear. The operator looked up. "It's real, sir. Large object moving slow. Could be a trawler, but..." They all knew it wasn't a trawler. Cruickshank nodded once. "We'll take a look." He turned the Catalina toward the contact. Outside, the first light of dawn began to stretch across the horizon. The sea glowed faintly silver. In that light, the shadow of a surfaced submarine appeared, long, narrow, unmistakable. He exhaled slowly. "Gentlemen, we have our U-boat." After hours of monotony, the air inside the aircraft snapped alive. Crewmen moved to their stations. The bomb aimer armed the depth charges. The gunners checked their sights. Cruickshank adjusted his flight path, eyes fixed on the target growing larger beneath them. "This is it," he said quietly. "Let's do it right." The dark outline of the U-boat cut across the glowing surface of the Norwegian Sea. Its conning tower gleamed wet under the pale light, crewmen moving quickly along the deck, unaware of the watchers in the sky. Cruickshank guided the Catalina into a gentle descent, one hand on the throttle, the other steady on the control column. Every man aboard felt the aircraft change pitch. Even before he spoke, they knew what was coming. "Attack run," he said. The order turned silence into motion. The bomb aimer crawled to the nose compartment. The navigator read distance. The gunners swung their turrets to cover the submarine's deck. In the cockpit, the co-pilot watched Cruickshank's profile, the calm face, the jaw set but not clenched. He had flown hundreds of hours with that same expression. Altitude dropped. Wind began to scream against the fuselage. 200 feet. 150. The U-boat crew saw them now. A man on deck pointed upward, another ran for the flak gun. Then the first burst of tracer fire clawed the sky. Orange lines ripped past the cockpit. One shell burst just short, throwing spray high over the wing. Another exploded beneath the fuselage, rocking the aircraft. Metal groaned. "Hold her steady," Cruickshank said. His voice never rose. The bombardier called out over the intercom, "Range, 800 yards, 604. "Steady," Cruickshank repeated. His eyes didn't move from the sight line. He flipped the switch on the control yoke. Bombs away. Nothing happened. The Catalina jolted but stayed heavy. The lever locked in place. "Failure on release," the voice from below shouted. Cruickshank pulled back hard, climbing through a storm of tracers. The sea fell away beneath them. For a moment, they were out of range again, engines laboring, smoke curling from a shallow hit on the port wing. The co-pilot looked at him. "Orders, sir?" Cruickshank kept his gaze on the altimeter. "We'll go around." "Sir, that gunner's awake now. He'll cut us to pieces if we—" He didn't finish. Cruickshank's tone stayed level. "We go again." Below, the submarine had turned slightly, its crew reloading. Water boiled around its hull as it tried to dive, but it was too late. The Catalina's shadow fell over them again. The aircraft banked wide, slow enough to make every second ache. Inside, the crew rechecked fuses and firing lines. No one argued now. They trusted the man at the controls. Cruickshank turned into the attack, lower this time, skimming the waves. The flak gun fired first. The air filled with white bursts. Each one sounded like a door slamming in a metal hallway. The Catalina shook as fragments tore through its skin. The navigator screamed a warning, "Direct hit, port side." But Cruickshank didn't waver. The U-boat was dead ahead. "Bombs away," he shouted again. The switch released cleanly. The aircraft lifted, light and free. 4 depth charges fell in a tight line, tumbling into the sea. A second later, the ocean erupted. Columns of water rose higher than the aircraft. The shockwave slammed into them, rattling bones and teeth. For an instant, the world went white. When the light cleared, the U-boat was gone. Only an oil slick and pieces of debris floated on the surface. Somewhere beneath the waves, steel was breaking apart. "Target destroyed," the bombardier said quietly. But their victory came at a price. Flak had torn through the fuselage on that last run. The navigator was down, motionless. Several others were bleeding. And Cruickshank himself sat slumped in his seat, breath coming fast and shallow. Blood spread across his jacket. The co-pilot turned toward him in shock. "Sir, you're hit." Cruickshank looked down at the dark stain spreading across his chest, then back at the horizon. "Get a damage report," he said. His voice was calm, but each word came harder than the last. The radio operator's call came through. "We've lost hydraulics. Rear gun jammed. Multiple holes along port fuselage." Cruickshank nodded. "We can still fly." He forced his hands to stay on the controls. Every movement burned. Shrapnel had torn through both lungs and 10 wounds to his legs, but he refused to let go. His co-pilot reached for the yoke. He shook his head. "Not yet." For 5 long minutes no one spoke. The aircraft limped eastward, engines uneven, wings bleeding fuel. Then he finally said, "Set course for home." The crew moved quickly. The wounded were bandaged as best they could. Blood pooled on the floorboards. The smell of smoke and iron filled the cabin. Through it all, the steady thrum of engines carried them forward. Cruickshank looked out across the water. The dawn was breaking now, cold, pale light spilling over the horizon. He had done what he came to do, but his own survival was far from certain. The men glanced at their captain. His uniform was soaked, his breathing shallow, yet his grip on the controls never faltered. They knew what it meant. As long as he was conscious, he would not surrender the aircraft to anyone else. And the journey home had only just begun. The Catalina was bleeding from a dozen wounds. Fuel leaked through torn metal. The left engine coughed, shuddered, and steadied again. Inside the cockpit, the smell of smoke and blood mixed into the cold air. Cruickshank sat upright, refusing to lean back, both hands fixed on the controls. His co-pilot turned to him, pale. "Sir, you need morphine. Let me take it." Cruickshank shook his head. "Not yet." His voice was barely more than a whisper. Shrapnel had pierced his lungs and legs. Every breath scraped like sandpaper inside his chest. But he knew the truth of their situation. If he passed out now, they would all die. The co-pilot was competent but inexperienced. The controls were half crippled, and navigation back to base meant flying 4 more hours over open sea with failing instruments. He spoke slowly between breaths. "We hold height, 2000. Keep the engines balanced. Don't climb, she won't take it." The crew moved with quiet efficiency as they had practiced for years. The navigator, wounded but conscious, plotted a return course. The gunners checked ammunition and cleared debris. No one panicked. Cruickshank had trained them too well for that. Minutes dragged into hours. The Arctic sun hung low, refusing to rise fully or set. The sky glowed like dull metal, endless and cold. Inside, the rhythm of the engines became a heartbeat for the 11 men aboard. They listened to it the way drowning men listen for air. If that sound changed, even slightly, it could mean the difference between living and dying. The co-pilot stole glances at Cruickshank. Blood darkened his tunic almost to black. His lips had turned gray, but his hands never wavered. He gave small instructions, no wasted words. "Trim 2 points starboard. Ease the throttle. Check port fuel," again. They did everything he said. At one point the wireless operator reported, "No contact with base, sir. Static only." Cruickshank nodded faintly. "Keep trying." It was all he said. Pain blurred his vision. He blinked to clear it, focused on the horizon, and forced his breathing to stay slow. He thought of his parents in Aberdeen, of quiet mornings walking along the harbor. He wondered if he would ever see it again. But he would not let go. Not while his crew depended on him. Hours later, clouds began to form, thick, low, rolling. The Catalina entered them like a ship into fog. Moisture froze instantly on the windscreen. The altimeter wavered. "Instrument loss," the navigator called. Cruickshank's mind cut through the noise. "Visual check, co-pilot on compass. We fly blind till we break through." They descended slightly, trusting instinct over gauges. The wings groaned under the strain. At last, they burst out beneath the cloud cover into clearer air. Below them, the gray sheen of the North Sea stretched toward the distant outline of Britain. Relief rippled through the crew, small, fragile, almost guilty. They were still alive. Cruickshank's head fell forward for a moment. The co-pilot reached to steady the controls. "Sir, please, let me." Cruickshank forced himself upright. "No, not yet." He knew the hardest part was still ahead. They had to land a half-crippled flying boat on rough water without flaps or proper hydraulics. One mistake and the aircraft would flip, tearing itself apart. He glanced at the co-pilot, eyes sharp even through pain. "Listen carefully. When we reach base, you'll take her down, but not until I tell you. I'll guide you in." "Understood." The younger man nodded, jaw tight. "Good," Cruickshank whispered. "Then let's get her home." The engines droned on, fading into the long hum of endurance. Below them, the sea waited, cold, patient, indifferent. And above it, one man's will kept 11 others alive. The return to Britain was a fight against time and blood loss. The Catalina crept south through heavy air, its engine struggling to stay synchronized. Every vibration traveled through the hull, rattling loose fittings, shaking frost from the seams. Inside, the temperature dropped close to freezing. The crew huddled in silence, too tired to speak, too afraid to relax. Cruickshank kept both hands on the controls. His gloves were slick with blood, but he refused to let anyone replace him. His breathing came in shallow gasps. Each inhale burned. The co-pilot watched him, helpless, ready to act if he collapsed, but he never did. Every few minutes, Cruickshank would whisper a command. "Course check. Altitude steady. Fuel?" Short words, precise words, the same tone he'd always used. That steadiness was a lifeline. As long as he sounded calm, they believed they might survive. At the navigator's table, The wounded man tried to keep up with his calculations. Blood stained the chart paper. The pencil snapped twice, but he carried on. "We should reach the Shetlands in 4 hours if the wind holds," he said. 4 hours. It might as well have been 4 years. Outside, the horizon blurred. Fog rolled in low from the Arctic, swallowing sky and sea together. The engines droned like a lullaby of exhaustion. Some of the crew began to drift in and out of half-sleep. Only Cruickshank stayed awake, forcing his mind to stay sharp by counting seconds between each instrument check. He could feel his strength fading. The blood loss made his vision dim at the edges, as if the world were closing in. He clenched his jaw and focused on the feel of the aircraft. Every pilot learns to listen to his machine. Every rattle and hum tells a story. He could feel when the port engine began to run rough and corrected it with a flick of the throttle. He could sense when the nose dipped a fraction too far and lifted it before the altimeter caught the change. The Catalina was an extension of his will now, wounded, limping, but alive. Hours passed. The sea beneath them shifted from black to gray, then to pale silver as dawn spread across the horizon. The sight almost broke him. Britain lay somewhere ahead, beyond that light, beyond the horizon he could barely see. At 7 a.m. the radio operator finally broke through static. A faint voice answered, a base controller at Selim Vo. "Catalina Wyok, we have you faint but readable. State condition." The operator looked toward the cockpit, waiting for Cruickshank. He gathered what little breath he had left. "This is Flight Lieutenant Cruickshank, Catalina JV-928. Enemy contact destroyed. Heavy damage. Multiple casualties. Request emergency landing clearance." There was a long pause, then static again. The controller's voice came back strained and formal. "Acknowledged JV-928. Weather at base deteriorating. Wind speed rising. Landing on open water unsafe. Advise holding pattern until sea state improves." The co-pilot frowned. "We can't hold, sir. Not in this condition." Cruickshank's eyes stayed on the horizon. "We'll circle until it's safe." "That's an order." He knew a crash landing in rough water would kill them all. Waiting meant pain, but it meant life. They began to circle. The engines coughed and caught again. Cruickshank's vision swam. He blinked hard to stay awake. The co-pilot begged him to take morphine, but he refused. "It'll cloud my head. I need to think." Minute by minute, the sea below calmed. The waves settled into slow, heavy rolls. After 2 hours of holding pattern, the radio operator called forward. "Base reports improvement. Green light to attempt landing." Cruickshank nodded once. He turned to the co-pilot, voice faint but clear. "You'll take her down. Follow my words exactly. I'll talk you through." He shifted slightly in his seat, blood stiffening the fabric of his uniform. The airframe trembled as the co-pilot reduced speed. Cruickshank guided him step by step, attitude, throttle, trim. His hands hovered over the controls, ready if the other faltered. At 200 feet he whispered, "Ease her now. Hold that line. Wait for the trough, now." The Catalina hit the water hard, bounced once, then settled into the swell. The hull groaned but held. Spray washed over the cockpit. The aircraft floated, alive. For a moment no one moved. Then cheers broke out, tired, hoarse, unbelieving. Cruickshank smiled faintly. "Everyone accounted for?" "Yes, sir. All safe." He nodded, eyes closing at last. "Good. Tell them, we made it." His head tilted forward, and for the first time since the attack, his hands slid from the controls. The Catalina floated on the cold gray surface of the Shetland waters, engines silent now except for the soft ticking of cooling metal. The aircraft had survived what should have destroyed it. The crew sat in stunned quiet, listening to the slow slap of waves against the hull. Outside, the sky had turned a pale, lifeless blue, the kind of light that never feels warm. In the cockpit, Cruickshank slumped forward, barely conscious. His tunic was soaked through with blood, dark and stiff from hours of flight. The co-pilot leaned toward him, voice breaking. "Sir, we're down. We're safe." Cruickshank's eyes flickered open. His lips moved, dry and cracked. "Good. Keep her steady." The words came out as a whisper. Medics and rescue crews arrived by launch from the base, their small boat cutting a white line across the sea. They climbed aboard with stretchers and blankets, faces set against the wind. The first thing they saw inside the Catalina was the blood, dark pools around the pilot's seat, streaks across the floor, smears on the walls where men had tried to brace themselves. It looked more like the inside of a battlefield than an aircraft. When they reached Cruickshank, he was conscious but fading fast. The doctor knelt beside him, checked his pulse, and looked up in disbelief. He's still alive? The co-pilot nodded. He's been flying like that for hours. Cruickshank tried to speak again, forcing each word. Crew, are they all safe? All safe, the doctor said softly. He managed a faint smile, then whispered, then that's all right. They lifted him carefully onto a stretcher, covering him with a blanket. As they carried him down the gangway, his blood dripped through the canvas, dotting the deck like a trail of crimson rain. The crew stood in silence, watching the man who had saved them disappear into the morning mist. At the hospital on Shetland, surgeons worked for hours. 72 wounds in total. Metal fragments lodged in his chest, lungs, legs, and arms. They operated through the day and into the night. Twice his heart stopped. Twice they brought him back. Word spread through the squadron before evening. Men who had been out on patrol returned to find their base changed. No one shouted, no one joked. They walked quietly as if the air itself demanded respect. In the mess hall, the surviving crew gathered together, cups of untouched tea cooling in front of them. The co-pilot sat apart, staring at his hands. One of the younger airmen broke the silence. He didn't have to go back for the second run. The co-pilot looked up. His voice was rough. He knew that. But he couldn't let it go. If that sub got away, it'd kill someone else tomorrow. He wasn't built to walk away. Outside, the wind howled across the water. The Catalina, now a scarred monument, rocked gently against its moorings. Its hull was pocked with holes, its paint burned and blistered, yet it floated, stubborn and defiant, just like its pilot. Days turned into weeks. Cruickshank drifted between life and death. The doctors called it a miracle that he survived at all. The bullets and shrapnel had missed his heart by inches. His lungs slowly healed, his strength returning little by little. When he was finally conscious enough to speak more than a few words, the first thing he asked about was the crew. All safe, the nurse told him again. He closed his eyes and whispered, good. His superiors visited soon after. They told him that his attack had destroyed the U-boat, saving an entire convoy bound for Russia. They also told him that his name would be put forward for the Victoria Cross, the highest award for bravery in the face of the enemy. He didn't respond for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. I did what anyone else would have done. But everyone in that room knew that wasn't true. Back at the squadron, the men kept his seat in the briefing room empty. The Catalina was repaired, its bullet holes patched, its engines tested, but none of them felt right flying it again. It wasn't just a machine anymore, it was a witness. The doctors said recovery would take months. Cruickshank, true to form, didn't complain. He listened, nodded, followed instructions. But at night, when the ward was quiet, he stared out at the dark window, watching the wind move across the sea. He had seen the edge of death and refused to cross it. He was 24 years old. Recovery was slow and painful. Cruickshank spent months in a military hospital in Shetland before being transferred to Scotland. Each wound had to heal on its own. Some were deep, others small but infected. The doctors said that no man should have been able to endure what he had. Yet every morning when they came to check his pulse, he was awake, eyes open, asking about the weather, the squadron, the war. He refused special treatment. The nurses said he was polite, even cheerful, though he rarely smiled. He would not speak about the attack unless someone asked directly. We did our duty, he would say. The others did theirs. That was all. He never spoke of fear, never described the moment of being hit, never boasted about the flight back. Silence was his shield. By September, his body had begun to mend. The worst of the wounds closed. He could stand with help, though he still moved stiffly. One of the nurses remarked that he never complained, even when the pain was clearly unbearable. She said that his calm made the ward quieter. Men who came in shouting left speaking softly. Outside the hospital, the war carried on. News of Normandy filled the papers. The world was moving fast again, but for Cruickshank, time seemed frozen. His world was the slow rhythm of breathing, the hiss of the oxygen line, the distant sound of aircraft engines overhead. Every time he heard them, he felt an ache, not in his chest but somewhere deeper. He wanted to be back in the air. In October, he was moved south to a convalescent home near Aberdeen. The doctors called it a transfer. To him, it was a homecoming. The air smelled of the sea again, and the wind carried the same old chill. Friends and family visited, careful not to overwhelm him. His father spoke of pride. His mother wept quietly but said nothing. John simply nodded, his voice still thin. It's good to be home, he said. When he was strong enough to walk, he took short strolls along the harbor. The fishermen recognized him. They didn't salute, they didn't cheer. They just tipped their hats as he passed, a quiet acknowledgement between men who understood what it meant to fight the sea and survive. In November 1944, the official notice arrived. Flight Lieutenant John Alexander Cruickshank was to be awarded the Victoria Cross for conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty in the face of the enemy. The citation described the attack, the injuries, the flight home, and the landing. It called him an example of the highest traditions of the Royal Air Force. The ceremony took place in London early the next year. He wore his uniform, still loose from weight loss, and stood as straight as his healing body allowed. When King George VI pinned the medal to his chest, he thanked him quietly. There were photographs, handshakes, and speeches, but Cruickshank looked uncomfortable with all of it. Reporters asked how he had managed to keep flying after being hit 72 times. He answered simply, there was no other way home. After the ceremony, he returned to Scotland. He did not seek fame, gave no interviews, and rarely mentioned the war again. He resumed work at the bank, sitting behind a desk where no one could see the scars beneath his suit. His colleagues said he was punctual, modest, and kind. A man who never lost his temper, never raised his voice, and always listened first. Years passed. The war faded into history, but the story of that night over the Norwegian Sea remained, a lesson in quiet courage. The men who had flown with him spoke of him as if he were something more than human. They said his calm had saved them. They said his voice had given them strength when the world was breaking apart. Cruickshank never claimed to be fearless. He once told a friend, I was afraid the whole time. But if I showed it, they'd lose hope. So I didn't. That was his secret, not the absence of fear but the mastery of it. He lived a long life after the war, far removed from the violence that had defined his youth. He rarely attended reunions, though he kept in touch with a few surviving crewmates. When they met, they didn't talk about the U-boat or the wounds. They talked about the weather, their families, their ordinary lives. That was enough. The medal remained tucked away, seldom displayed. When asked why, he would say, it belongs to all of them, not just me. And in a quiet way, he was right. Decades passed, and the war that had defined a generation began to fade into photographs and school lessons. Yet the story of Flight Lieutenant John Alexander Cruickshank never disappeared. It was retold in RAF briefings, in veteran halls, and in the quiet corners of museums where people stopped to read his name engraved beneath the words Victoria Cross. To many, he remained a symbol of composure, the man who stayed conscious when his body tried to give up, who refused morphine because it might dull his mind, who landed a crippled aircraft so that others could live. But those who had known him personally remembered something else. They remembered gentleness, restraint, and an unwillingness to be called a hero. He never corrected anyone who used the word, but he never embraced it either. In interviews late in life, he avoided dramatics. I was one of many, he said. I did what had to be done, that's all. His sentences were as clipped as his flying orders once were. No excess, no self-praise. When younger RAF officers visited him, they often expected a lecture on bravery. Instead, he would tell them that courage was mostly preparation and calm. He explained that fear never vanishes. It only becomes manageable through habit and duty. His advice was simple: know your craft. Trust your crew. Do your work quietly. Those who heard him remembered it for the rest of their careers. By the time he retired from banking, most of his generation had already gone. The Shetland base where he had flown was long closed, its hangars rusting in the wind. But every year on Remembrance Day, a small group gathered by the water. They placed a wreath for those lost in the cold North Sea. Sometimes Cruickshank attended, standing apart from the crowd, cap in hand, eyes fixed on the horizon. He would stay silent during the ceremony, then leave before anyone could thank him. The younger officers learned to give him space. They understood that for men like him, peace was not the absence of war. It was the act of living quietly after surviving it. When he spoke of that night, which he rarely did, he never mentioned the pain or the fear. He talked about his crew, the co-pilot who kept the plane steady, the navigator who marked the chart through blood, the gunners who stayed at their posts. They did as much as I did, he'd say. More maybe. His humility became part of his legend. Teachers used his story to explain duty. Pilots studied his decision-making as a model of control under pressure. And among ordinary people, his name became a reminder that heroism often speaks softly. When he reached old age, living quietly in Edinburgh, letters sometimes arrived from strangers, students, soldiers, even children, thanking him for what he had done. He answered each one by hand in the same careful script he had used all his life. I am grateful for your kindness, he would write, but I did nothing alone. In 2014, on the 70th anniversary of his mission, A restored Catalina flew over Shetland in his honor. It glided low over the same waters where he had once fought to survive. The crowd below watched as the plane circled and banked toward the sea. For a moment, it seemed the past and present had met, the machine that carried his courage returning home again. He watched the footage later that evening on television. His daughter said that as the aircraft appeared on screen, he smiled quietly and said, "She was a good ship." Then he turned the sound down and sat in silence for a while. When he died in 2020 at the age of 99, tributes poured in from across the world. The RAF called him a man who represented the finest qualities of leadership and resolve. Newspapers described his story in headlines of awe. But among his family and friends, the memory that stayed was simpler. The soft-spoken man who carried his groceries himself, who remembered every birthday, who never once bragged about what he had done. His Victoria Cross rests today in the Imperial War Museum in London, polished but quiet, its ribbon faded by time. Visitors stop to read the plaque, some only for a moment, others long enough to feel the weight of what it represents. It is more than a medal. It is the echo of a promise kept. Proof that one man's steady will can hold back the dark. 72 wounds. One man. One flight home. If stories like this still make you stop and think, if they remind you that real courage is calm, not loud, then don't just leave now. Stay with us. There are hundreds more voices like Cruickshank's waiting to be heard. Pilots who vanished, medics who refused to give up, civilians who changed the course of a war with a single decision. Hit subscribe so you never lose them again. Leave a comment below. Tell us what part of Cruickshank's story stayed with you most. Your words keep these memories alive. Because history doesn't fade when you remember it. It fades when you scroll past. So pause here, take a breath, and join the circle of people who refuse to forget. Subscribe. Remember, carry the story forward.